Hi guys, imagine the most destructive force on the battlefield wasn't a tank, a bomb, or an enemy squadron, but a mountain. In the spring of 1944, an American airbase in Italy lost 88 B-25 bombers in a single terrifying day. But these warbirds weren't shot down by enemy fighters, they were melted, crushed, and completely obliterated by the wrath of Mount Vesuvius. This is the incredible, almost unbelievable true story of when the deadliest conflict in human history was literally forced to hit the pause button by the unstoppable power of Mother Nature. Welcome to a forgotten chapter of World War II. Before we get started, if you enjoy exploring hidden corners of history at a slower pace, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments where in the world you're tuning in from. I'd love to connect with you there. The year is 1944, and the Allied forces are locked in a grueling, bloody slog up the Italian peninsula. The Italian campaign is notorious for its rugged terrain, relentless rain, and fierce enemy resistance. Every single mile of advance cost thousands of lives. The Allies had established a massive logistical and offensive network across southern Italy to support the frontline troops. Central to this network was air superiority. American bombers were flying daily missions, pounding enemy supply lines, rail yards, and fortified positions to soften the brutal road to Rome. Just a few miles from the front lines, nestled in the shadow of one of the world's most famous landmarks, sat the Pompeii airfield. It was a bustling hub of American military might. The base was home to the 340th Bombardment Group of the United States Army Air Forces. These men were battle-hardened veterans of the Mediterranean theatre, flying the rugged and reliable B-25 Mitchell medium bombers. They had survived flak, enemy interceptors, and treacherous weather, but absolutely nothing in their training manuals could have prepared them for what was about to happen right in their own backyard. The Pompeii airfield, formerly known as Tersigno, was strategically placed near the ruins of the ancient Roman city of Pompeii. The massive silhouette of Mount Vesuvius loomed directly over the runway, a constant, silent spectator to the mechanical roar of the 20th century war. For the young American pilots and ground crews, the volcano was just a dramatic backdrop for souvenir photos. No one seriously thought the mountain was a threat. It hadn't had a truly catastrophic eruption since 1906, and the military planners considered the location perfectly safe. Life on the base was a mix of intense combat stress and long periods of boredom. Crews would fly harrowing missions over heavily defended targets, return to base, and try to unwind under the Italian sun. Vesuvius was almost like a giant sleeping mascot, but in mid-March of 1944, the mascot began to stir. The local Italian villagers, whose families had lived in the shadow of the mountain for generations, began to notice subtle changes. The earth started to tremble with low, deep rumbles. Small plumes of dark smoke began to lazily drift from the crater. At first, the American troops treated it as a spectacular free show. They would stand outside their tents, pointing and marvelling at the glowing red fissures that started to appear near the summit at night. It was a beautiful, almost hypnotic distraction from the grim reality of the global war raging just miles to the north. But this was not a harmless light show. Deep within the Earth's crust, immense pressure was building up, pushing a massive column of magma toward the surface. The beast that had buried an entire civilization nearly 2,000 years ago was waking up, completely indifferent to the armies fighting at its feet. Nature was preparing to remind humanity exactly who was really in charge. By March 18th, the situation began to escalate rapidly. The lazy plumes of smoke transformed into a towering, terrifying pillar of black ash that blocked out the sun. The rumbling grew louder, vibrating through the boots of the airmen on the tarmac. Then, the lava began to flow. Rivers of molten rock cascaded down the slopes of Vesuvius, swallowing ancient villages, vineyards, and roads in their path. The United States military suddenly found itself dealing with a massive humanitarian crisis right in the middle of a war zone. Allied forces were immediately diverted from combat duties. Trucks that were supposed to be hauling ammunition and rations to the front lines were hurriedly repurposed to evacuate terrified Italian civilians from the advancing lava. Bulldozers intended for clearing runways were sent to build desperate earthen dams, trying in vain to divert the relentless flow of liquid fire. For a brief, surreal moment, the war against the Axis forces took a back seat. The only enemy that mattered now was the Volcano. The 341st Bombardment Group continued to fly missions when they could, taking off directly beneath the monstrous ash cloud. Pilots reported seeing the glowing red throat of the volcano from the air, a sight that made even the most seasoned combat veterans shudder. However, the command structure still believed the Pompeii airfield was safe. The lava was flowing down a different side of the mountain, away from the base. They thought they had dodged a bullet. They were dead wrong. On the morning of March 21st, the wind abruptly shifted. Until now, the prevailing winds had blown the massive ash cloud away from the American base. But now, the wind turned and blew directly over the Pompeii airfield. The sky turned a sickening, apocalyptic shade of bruised purple. And then, high noon turned into midnight. The sun was completely blotted out by a wall of choking dust. And then, it began to rain. But this wasn't water. It was a lethal downpour of tephra, volcanic ash, pumice, and chunks of rock the size of baseballs. The men of the 340th Bombardment Group scrambled for their lives. The air became so thick with toxic sulfur and jagged glass-like particles that breathing felt like inhaling razor blades. Soldiers tied wet rags over their faces and wore their steel combat helmets just to walk from their tents to the mess hall. The noise was deafening. Millions of stones pelted the corrugated metal roofs of the base buildings and the aluminum skins of the parked bombers, sounding like an endless barrage of machine gun fire. Tents collapsed under the immense weight of the accumulating ash. Panic set in as the ground crews realized the terrifying dangers to their precious aircraft. Out on the tarmac, 88 B-25 Mitchell bombers sat completely exposed to the wrath of Vesuvius. These were tough, resilient war machines, designed to take enemy anti-aircraft fire and keep flying. But they were absolutely defenseless against this geological bombardment. The hot ash began to melt the plexiglass canopies and gun turrets. The sheer weight of the volcanic debris ripped the fabric control surfaces to shreds. As the rain of fiery stones continued hour after hour, the planes began to physically buckle. Landing gear collapsed. Wings snapped off. Engines were hopelessly clogged with abrasive dust, cementing them shut forever. Men tried desperately to sweep the ash off the wings, but it was falling faster than they could clear it. It was a completely futile battle. In a matter of hours, an entire American bomber fleet, worth millions of dollars and crucial to the war effort, was being methodically beaten to death by a mountain. The onslaught lasted for days, turning the once busy Pompeii airfield into a grey alien landscape. The men could only watch helplessly from their reinforced shelters as their magnificent flying machines were slowly buried alive. Each B-25 bomber weighed over 20,000 pounds, yet they were swallowed by the ash as if they were mere toys. The pumice stones, falling at terrifying speeds, shattered the intricate glass noses where the bombardiers sat, filling the cockpits with deadly debris. But it wasn't just the impact that caused the destruction. It was the intense, searing heat. The ash was literally baking the aircraft from the outside in, cooking the sensitive flight instruments and melting the rubber tires right off the heavy landing gear. The fabric that covered the flight control surfaces, the ailerons, elevators and rudders, simply burned away, leaving behind bare metal skeletons. As the heavy volcanic sand accumulated on the tail sections, the center of gravity drastically shifted. One by one, the mighty planes began to tip violently backward. Their noses pointed uselessly toward the darkened, smoke-filled sky in a final, agonizing surrender. It was a heartbreaking sight for the mechanics who had poured their blood and sweat into keeping these birds flying. They had patched these planes up after brutal encounters with enemy flak, replacing shredded metal and broken engines overnight. But against the endless rain of molten rock, their wrenches and rivet guns were entirely useless. The sheer volume of falling earth was incomprehensible, packing into every exposed vent, gun barrel, and engine cowling. The world they knew was disappearing under a thick, choking blanket of destruction, erasing the lines between human engineering and ancient geological power. Finally, the base commander made the only logical call left to make. The order was given to evacuate the Pompeii airfield immediately. The men grabbed whatever personal belongings they could carry, threw them into the backs of transport trucks, and fled the shadow of the mountain. They were a battle-tested unit, used to retreating under heavy artillery fire, but running from a volcano was a deeply humbling experience. They drove through roads clogged with terrified locals and thick, blinding ash, heading for an alternate airfield further south. Behind them, the 88 bombers were left entirely to the mercy of Vesuvius. It was one of the largest single losses of American aircraft of the entire conflict, but this time there was no enemy nation to blame, no retaliatory strike to plan, and no tactical adjustments to be made. The greatest military machine ever assembled was completely powerless. They had conquered islands, crossed oceans, and defeated entrenched armies, but they could not stop a hole in the ground from spewing fire and rock. The retreat was chaotic, with visibility reduced to mere feet. Headlights on the jeeps and trucks barely pierced the swirling gloom, and drivers had to stick their heads out the windows just to keep the vehicles on the road. The psychological toll on the airmen was strange and profound. They felt as though they had been ambushed by the Earth itself. Several days later, the violent tremors subsided, and the sky slowly began to clear, revealing a sickly, pale sun. The eruption had finally spent its fury. Cautiously, the soldiers of the 341st Bombardment Group returned to their base to assess the damage. What they found looked exactly like the surface of the moon. The vibrant green Italian countryside had been entirely erased, replaced by a desolate, monochromatic wasteland of grey and black. The runway, the tents, the supply dumps, everything was buried under feet of heavy, compacted volcanic ash. And then there were the plains. It was a sprawling graveyard of twisted aluminum and melted glass. Of the entire fleet parked on that tarmac, 88, B-25, Mitchell bombers were declared a total unsalvageable loss. Teams of mechanics waded through the knee-deep ash, trying to see if any engines or radios could be salvaged, but the abrasive dust had penetrated every single mechanical crevice. The fine volcanic grit acted like sandpaper, destroying the precise inner workings of the radial engines. The aircraft were completely written off, transformed from lethal weapons of war into expensive buried scrap metal in just a matter of hours. The men walked among the ruins in stunned silence, occasionally kicking at the solid blocks of ash that had once been soft canvas tents. The destruction was so thorough, so absolute, that it felt less like battle damage and more like an ancient archaeological site that had been uncovered millennia too soon. To put this incredible loss into perspective, you have to look at the cold, hard numbers of the air war over Europe. The Axis forces, with all their advanced anti-aircraft guns, radar systems, and seasoned fighter pilots, fought tooth and nail against every single Allied bombing raid. It would typically take the enemy many months of brutal, high-casualty aerial combat to shoot down 88 American bombers. Mother Nature, on the other hand, casually wiped out that exact same number before lunchtime, without taking a single casualty of her own. It was a stark, sobering reminder of scale. Humanity was engaged in the most destructive conflict in its history, tearing cities apart with high explosives and incendiary bombs, believing they controlled the ultimate power. Yet, compared to the raw, unbridled energy released by Mount Vesuvius, the entire World War seemed almost insignificant. The volcano produced more explosive energy in a few hours than all the ordnance dropped in the war combined up to that point. Miraculously, despite the catastrophic destruction of military hardware, not a single American soldier was killed by the eruption at the Pompeii airfield. The evacuation had been chaotic, but incredibly successful. The base command had prioritized human life over the machines, making the tough but correct choice to abandon the multi-million-dollar fleet when the ash began to crush the camp. It was a tiny silver lining in a cloud of massive devastation, proving that even when facing the apocalypse, good leadership could save lives. The loss of the bombers was a massive logistical headache for the Allied command, forcing them to rapidly reroute replacement aircraft from other theatres of war just to keep the pressure on the retreating enemy lines. Generals sitting in comfortable offices in Washington and London read the after-action reports in absolute disbelief. The idea that a mountain had caused a major disruption to the strategic bombing campaign sounded like a bad joke or a poor excuse, until the aerial reconnaissance photographs were finally developed and placed on their desks. The images showed a scene so bizarre and devastating that no general could argue with it. The Pompeii airfield disaster became a classified legend among the high command, a whispered story about the day the Earth fought back and won. The immediate challenge wasn't just cleaning up the physical mess, It was replacing a massive gaping hole in the Allied strike force. 88 heavy bombers missing from the roster meant that entire tactical missions over northern Italy and southern France had to be completely scrapped or severely scaled back. The Allied war machine was incredibly hungry, and Vesuvius had just starved a critical sector. Replacement aircraft had to be sourced immediately to keep the pressure on the retreating Axis forces. The United States industrial complex was operating at absolute peak capacity, churning out planes by the hour back in factories across Michigan and California, but getting them to the Italian front was a terrifying logistical nightmare. They had to be flown across the treacherous Atlantic via the southern route, or loaded onto massive, slow-moving cargo ships that were constantly hunted by enemy submarines. Every single delayed day gave the opposition precious time to rebuild their own shattered infrastructure. The 341st Bombardment Group was effectively grounded. They were a highly decorated squadron of lethal pilots, left entirely without wings, forced to wait in a makeshift tent city miles away from the hazardous ash zone. They spent their long, quiet days playing baseball in the dirt, reading 2-month-old newspapers from home, and constantly watching the skies for the arrival of new silver birds. It was a frustrating, surreal pause in a brutal war that demanded constant forward momentum. While the frustrated airmen waited for their new planes, the reality of the disaster hit the local Italian population with devastating force. The American military had lost replaceable mechanical assets, but the villagers living on the slopes of the mountain had lost absolutely everything they owned. Whole historic towns were simply wiped off the map, slowly crushed under unstoppable, creeping walls of magma that swallowed stone houses like they were made of matchsticks. In a remarkable display of compassion, the grounded combat veterans turned into humanitarian relief workers. The US Army rapidly deployed its heavy engineering equipment, which was initially meant to clear bomb damage, to push back cooling lava flows and clear ash-choked roadways for civilian evacuation. Cooks who normally prepared hurried meals for pilots started running massive, around-the-clock soup kitchens to feed thousands of hungry, displaced refugees. Army medics exhausted their supplies, treating severe burns, eye injuries, and respiratory issues caused by breathing the toxic, sulfur-heavy air. For a fleeting moment, the soldiers stopped trying to win a war and focused entirely on saving human lives. This sudden, dramatic shift in mission created a deep, unexpected bond between the occupying Allied forces and the local population, united by a shared tragedy, orchestrated by the Earth itself. The tragic irony of the entire situation was absolutely impossible for anyone to ignore. Just a short drive from the destroyed military airbase lay the world-famous ruins of Pompeii, an ancient city famously frozen in time by the exact same volcano in the year 79 AD. American soldiers suddenly found themselves living out a 20th century reboot of one of history's most famous disasters. Some of the officers and flight crews had even toured the ancient Roman ruins on their rare days off, marvelling at the haunting plaster casts of people caught in the ancient ashfall. Now their own cutting-edge aviation technology was suffering the exact same apocalyptic fate. Future archaeologists, the airmen joked grimly among themselves, would dig up this specific layer of Earth centuries from now and find perfectly preserved B-25 bombers resting right next to Roman chariots. It put the entire concept of human advancement into a very harsh, unforgiving perspective. Humanity had learned to fly through the clouds, to harness massive explosions, and to communicate across vast oceans, but they were still just as incredibly vulnerable to the mountain's raw wrath as a Roman citizen was nearly 2 millennia ago. All our modern armour and horsepower meant absolutely nothing when the continental plates decided to shift. Eventually, official orders came down from command to salvage whatever was left of the ruined airfield. Recovery teams returned to the grey wasteland with bulldozers, heavy cranes and shovels. Their job was no longer to save the beautiful planes, but to aggressively strip them of usable scrap metal and ensure no sensitive radio equipment was left intact. The once proud airfield now looked exactly like a post-apocalyptic scrapyard. Mechanics brutally ripped out heavy 50 caliber machine guns that had somehow survived the intense heat and pulled oxygen tanks that could be repurposed for the hospital units. But amidst the grueling cleanup, the soldiers also did something incredibly human. They started making unique souvenirs. Enterprising young men carved the hardened, dark volcanic rock into ashtrays, paperweights, and crude rings. Some even took chunks of the thick, melted plexiglass from the bombers' destroyed noses, polishing them into clear pendants to send home to their wives and sweethearts. These were morbid but fascinating trophies of the day they survived the wrath of Mount Vesuvius. Within a few short weeks, the 340th was officially relocated to a much safer airfield down the coast. A fresh batch of shining new bombers finally arrived, and the unit was immediately thrust back into the relentless meat grinder of the war. The volcanic pause was officially over. The return to combat was a jarring, almost surreal experience for the men of the 340th Bombardment Group. They had just survived a literal act of God, a localized apocalyptic event that made the deadliest human weapons look like fragile children's toys. Flying back into heavy enemy fire felt strangely different after watching a mountain melt an entire fleet of aircraft. Many pilots noted a profound, unexpected shift in their own psychology. Before the eruption, the fear of enemy flak and interceptor fighter planes was an all-consuming terror. But after witnessing the raw, unstoppable, earth-shattering power of Vesuvius, the man-made explosions in the sky seemed somehow smaller, almost manageable by comparison. They had looked directly into the glowing red throat of the Earth itself and walked away unharmed. This bizarre survival guilt mixed with a sudden, newfound sense of invincibility. If a roaring volcano couldn't kill them while they slept in their canvas tents, maybe the enemy couldn't kill them in the air. This strange psychological armour actually helped carry them through the brutal, grueling final years of the Italian campaign. However, the traumatic memories of the choking ash and the deafening, endless roar of the falling pumice never truly left them. Veterans later confessed they would wake up in cold sweats, not from nightmares of aerial dogfights, but from the phantom, choking smell of sulphur and burning aluminum. You might be wondering why an event of this massive destructive scale isn't a widely known staple of World War II history. The answer lies heavily in the strict military censorship of the era. When 88 strategic bombers are completely wiped out without the enemy firing a single shot, you do not broadcast that information to the world. The Allied High Command was absolutely terrified that the Axis powers would use this freak disaster as a massive morale-boosting propaganda victory. They feared the enemy could easily spin it as a sign of divine intervention, claiming that even the Italian earth itself was rising up to violently fight off the American invaders. Therefore, a tight gag order was immediately placed on the entire incident. Newsreels back in the United States were strictly forbidden from showing any footage of the ruined, buried aircraft. Journalists who were embedded with the troops were heavily censored. They were allowed only to report on the heartwarming humanitarian relief efforts, but explicitly banned from mentioning the catastrophic military losses. The official damage reports were quickly buried deep within classified filing cabinets, hidden completely away from the public eye for decades. It wasn't until long after the global conflict ended, when information was finally declassified and aging veterans started sharing their personal photo albums, that the true, staggering extent of the Pompeii airfield disaster finally came to light. As for Mount Vesuvius itself, the catastrophic eruption of March 1944 marked the sudden end of a very violent era. After violently clearing its throat and casually destroying the American bomber fleet, the Great Mountain suddenly fell completely silent. It was almost as if the volcano had delivered its final devastating message to humanity and decided to simply go back to sleep. In fact, Vesuvius has not had a major full-scale eruption since that fateful, destructive week during the Second World War. Today, the mountain sits peacefully overlooking the modern, sprawling city of Naples, its infamous crater currently plugged with solid rock. But leading geologists around the world know that it is only a temporary deceiving slumber. Vesuvius remains one of the most dangerous active volcanoes on the entire planet. Interestingly, the deep, nutrient-rich volcanic ash from the 1944 eruption eventually transformed into incredibly fertile soil. Over the decades, it breathed new life into the local Italian vineyards and farms that had been completely wiped off the map. The earth violently destroyed, but it also generously replenished. Yet, beneath that lush green landscape buried deep under decades of new growth and modern development, there are still microscopic traces of melted aluminum and shattered plexiglass. They are the permanent hidden scars of the day, a massive war machine met a force of nature it simply could not defeat. The destruction of the 341st Bombardment Group at the Pompeii airfield remains one of the most bizarre, fascinating, and awe-inspiring footnotes in global military history. It is a story that sounds exactly like an exaggerated Hollywood script, yet every single detail of the destruction is absolutely true. It serves as a harsh, humbling reminder that no matter how advanced, powerful, or destructive human civilization becomes, we are still just temporary guests on this planet. The Allied forces possessed the greatest industrial and military might the world had ever seen, fully capable of toppling massive empires and completely reshaping the globe. But in the face of shifting tectonic plates and a natural buildup of subterranean magma, all of that incredible human power was instantly rendered entirely useless. Nature does not recognize invading armies, it does not respect military uniforms, and it certainly does not care about global conflicts. The 1944 eruption of Vesuvius was a violent, spectacular timeout called by Mother Earth herself. It forced the world's most lethal, hardened warriors to put down their guns, pick up shovels, and remember exactly who truly rules the world. Thanks for watching, guys. If you found this forgotten piece of history as fascinating as I did, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel for more incredible true stories, and let me know down in the comments what you think about this crazy event. See you in the next one.